Today, we're taking a look at another server processor, the Xeon E5310, a 1.6 GHz quad-core CPU released back in 2006. This will also be the first CPU I've tested since the upgrade to Windows 10, so there unfortunately won't be any comparison CPUs in the charts yet. I could have waited until I had more CPUs to show, but it has been over 2 weeks since the last video, and I wanted to get another video for you all, so hopefully you won't mind for now. That aside, I've also introduced a few more non-gaming benchmarks as well, which are 7-zip compression and decompression benchmarks, and an encoding benchmark using H.264 in Handbrake. First though, let's take a quick look at the specs of the E5310. The 5310, much like AMD's Ryzen CPUs today, doesn't have all of its cores on a single bit of silicon. In fact, the 5310's 4 cores come in the form of 2 separate dual-core dies, like the consumer-grade Core 2 Quad range. The 5310 is based on the Clovertown architecture, which is the server version of the Kentsfield architecture used in the first run of Core 2 Quads, which itself is actually based on the Conroe architecture found in the original Core 2 Duos. The 5310 packed 582 million transistors built on the 65nm fabrication process, and had 256 kilobytes of L1 cache per core. It also has 8 megabytes of L2 cache in total, but this is split between the 2 dual-core dies, giving each die 4 megabytes each, which is then shared between the 2 cores on each die. Starting off with 7-zip, and we're running the built-in benchmark in 3 blocks, with each individual block consisting of 4 runs of the benchmark. We then take an average score from each of these 3 blocks and average them together to get our final score. The built-in benchmark is the same benchmark that Gamers Nexus, a far larger YouTube channel, use for their 7-zip testing as well. So if you're looking for a good comparison of how the scores you see on this channel compare to modern day CPUs, I'd really encourage you to check out their channel as well. Or just check them out full stop, because their content is really good anyway. That aside, the Xeon E5310 scored 6,545 MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, in the compression part of the benchmark. And with a 2.658 GHz overclock, the maximum we could achieve before the motherboard itself became unstable, this jumped up to 9,950.33 MIPS, equating to an increase in score of 52.03% over stock. Decompression-wise, at stock, the 5310 managed 8,768 MIPS, with the overclock bumping this up by 64.52% to 14,425 MIPS. Blender is up next, and we're using the fishy cat scene specifically, which, compared to what most people would use Blender for, is a relatively simple animation. Still, it provides a good representation of what simple animation could be like if you were using this processor. The benchmark is run 3 times, rendering a single frame, with an average time taken from the 3 runs as the final score. The Xeon at stock took nearly 5 minutes to complete the render, but this dropped to just over 3 minutes with the overclock, a decrease of 38.19% over stock. To put into a bit more perspective the difference in render time, the fishy cat scene runs for 100 frames, so that 112.72 second decrease in time to render a single frame would equate to a total time saving across the entire animation of just under 3 hours and 8 minutes over what stock would manage. And lastly for the non-gaming benchmarks is Handbrake. For this, I'm using the exact same file that was uploaded to YouTube for the Athlon 2 X4640 video. This is a 1440p 60fps H.264 video with 192 kilobit per second AAC audio. And for the benchmark, I'm encoding this down to 1080p 60fps at 20 megabits per second using Handbrake's CPU-only H.264 encoder, with the AAC audio left alone and passed straight through to the final output. The specific settings used are in the chart. Compressing the videos down to 1080p will eventually become quite useful for me as I begin to run out of hard drive space in the future and therefore need to compress the back catalogue of videos down to save space. When that happens though, I will be using Handbrake's H.264 NVENC encoder with the GTX 1080 in the editing rig instead of the CPU-only H.264 encoder that's being used for the purposes of this benchmark. That aside, the Xeon took over an hour and a half to encode the video, at 97 minutes 56 seconds, with the 2.658 GHz overclock, reducing this by 37.83%, 60 minutes and 52.8 seconds. First up for the games is GTA 5, which is running here at 1080p on the lowest settings, with 16x anisotropic filtering enabled. GTA 5 loves quad-core CPUs and is able to take great advantage of them. Here, however, performance isn't great. The game has some texture streaming issues with parts of the road throughout the city not rendering in time. Frame times are inconsistent throughout the city and desert areas, which is represented by noticeable micro-stuttering in these parts of the map. It does get smoother on the highway heading towards the desert though. Stock managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, 37.7, 20.3 and 10.8 FPS respectively, according to CapFrameX. And as you can see, this is improved massively by the overclock, which managed 50.6, 32 and 25.8 FPS average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. This improvement is represented in gameplay as well, as there are only a few brief stutters throughout the city. There were no issues with texture streaming, and despite frame time still being noticeably inconsistent, they were far better in stock and can easily be put up with. CSGO is next up, and this is running at 1080p medium settings with 16x anisotropic filtering enabled. There was noticeable micro-stuttering throughout, indicating inconsistent frame times, which is the time it takes a frame to be displayed on screen. FPS could drop to the low 20s in close combat, and there were numerous spikes in frame times throughout, often reaching up to around 193 milliseconds, with far more spikes throughout the game that were less severe than that, but still noticeable as well. This is also evidenced by the benchmark figures of 52.7, 20.8 and 10.5 FPS for average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. And much like GTA 5, the OC improved things massively as you can see from the figures, which show improvements of 68.5, 87.5 and 95.24% to average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. There was still some noticeable micro-stutter at points, but this was barely noticeable now. Next is Rise of the Tomb Raider, which is being run at 1080p with the lowest settings, 16x anisotropic filtering and in DX11 mode. There was significant stuttering at the start of the test, which had a noticeable effect on combat as well, making it more difficult than it should be. There were also issues with a couple of the scripted sequences in the game as well, in that they either took ages to start or didn't start at all, leading to your death, which is nice and convenient if you ask me, so props to the Xeon for that. There was noticeable stuttering in both the Soviet installation and copper mill, with the stuttering being more apparent in the copper mill specifically. Frame times were generally inconsistent throughout, but some parts did manage to run smooth. Stock clocks managed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, 36.9, 11 and 3.8 FPS respectively. The overclock made pretty decent improvements to performance, at 40.92, 65.45 and 76.32% improvements to average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. Despite the big improvement, the same issues that stock clocks had remained. They were just less severe. So you'd probably be wanting to pick something more powerful than 5310 to be able to comfortably play this. Last up for the games today is 2016's Doom. This was run at 1080p with the lowest settings and 16x anisotropic filtering enabled. Both OpenGL and Vulkan modes were used, and the difference between the two is huge. We'll go into that more when we get into the charts though. For now, let's talk about Vulkan's performance. The game performed far better than I was initially expecting, with performance throughout being reasonably smooth, other than a couple of occasions where some micro-stuttering would be noticeable. Frame times throughout were inconsistent, and on occasion were actually more inconsistent than when using OpenGL, most likely caused by the CPU usage being closer to 100% with Vulkan than it was with OpenGL. Overall though, performance was far smoother when using Vulkan, so let's get the chart up and see by how much better it was. At stock, OpenGL could only manage 46.7 FPS, whereas Vulkan shot this up to 68.9, an improvement of 47.54% in average frame rate just by changing the rendering API. 1% and 0.1% lows improved as well, at 30.9 and 20.6 FPS respectively with Vulkan, compared to 24.9 and 11.8 FPS respectively with OpenGL. Figures improved massively with the overclock. with average 1% and 0.1% lows for Vulkan at 100.7, 52.2 and 38.9 FPS respectively. Frame times were still a bit inconsistent, but the frame rate was high enough to not notice. Performance was pretty much perfect with Vulkan and was fairly reasonable with OpenGL now too, although as you can see from OpenGL's 0.1% low of 18.5 with the overclock, there will still be some noticeable stuttering at times. We're finishing off on power draw for the E5310 today. First up is idle power draw, and despite being overclocked by just over 1 GHz over stock, the 5310 manages to pull 35.51% less power than it does at stock. 9.9 watts plus minus 3% with the overclock, compared to 15.49 watts plus minus 3% at stock. This is down to the Xeon being able to run a lower voltage for the overclock than the motherboard's auto voltage at stock. 1.264 volts for the overclock versus 1.275 at stock. This changes under load though, as you can see from the power draw in Blender. The 5310 only pulls 46.1 watts plus minus 3% at stock clocks, but this jumps up to 74.96 watts with the overclock. This works out to an increase in power draw over stock of 62.6% for only a 38.19% decrease in time to render, showing the Xeon's inefficiency once OC'd. Internal testing though showed that the H.264 encoding benchmark I ran with Handbrake pulls more power than Blender does in the fishy cat scene. So for the future, I'll be looking into the feasibility of measuring power draw in Handbrake instead of Blender, although that may prove difficult to get accurate measurements due to how long the benchmark takes to run. To finish up today, the 5310 performs surprisingly well, especially considering that it is nearly 14 years old now. It released back in 2006, yet, most overclocked, it manages to achieve playable and enjoyable levels of performance in GTA 5 and Doom, games released on the PC 9 and 10 years respectively after the Xeon was. The problem with this particular Xeon though is that it is quite limited in its overclocking potential compared to Core 2 quads that use the same architecture. It has a base frequency of 1.6 GHz, which it achieves with a multiplier of 6, which is the number that it multiplies the front-side bus speed by to get the speed the CPU runs at. So in the Xeon's case, 6 times the front-side bus speed of 266 MHz gives you the 1600 MHz or 1.6 GHz that the CPU runs at. And because that multiplier is so low, you have to massively increase the FSB to actually get a decent overclock. And the motherboard itself was the limiting factor for this overclock, because the motherboard became unstable with how high we had to run the FSB to get the overclock that we did. So it is quite limited in a sense compared to the Core 2 quads of the same era, because the Core 2 quads have a much higher multiplier, therefore allowing you to run a lower front-side bus speed to get a much higher overclock. Before we close out the video today, I'd like to give shoutouts to Patreon supporters TazFaeDodge, ShadowInTheVoid and Peter for helping to make all of this possible. So if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment and a like, and subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see more content like this. And don't forget to share the video as well. And you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/BenchyTests or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/BenchyTests. And remember, Ko-fi has a hyphen between the KO and the FI. And if you do decide to become a patron, you'll gain early access to all of my videos before the public does, for as long as you remain a patron. So thanks again for watching. Hopefully we'll see you next time.